The goal of this video is to walk you guys through the assignment sheet for your second paper on analyzing early American ideals. So I'll kind of run through the main prompt and then talk about some of the finer details of the paper. And of course, if you have any questions, please email me at any point. I'm happy to answer questions, take a look at some drafts if you have them, thesis statements, ideas, whatever. All right, so my question for you is, where in modern America do we see an ideal of one or more of our early American texts expressed or rejected in law, in practice, in political rhetoric, or in popular media? Okay, so let's break that down a little bit and think about how we are going to have to approach this assignment in order to answer this question. All right, so first, where in modern America do we see an ideal of one or more of our early American texts expressed or rejected? Okay, we'll stop there. So the first thing that you're going to have to do is pick at least one of the texts that we have read or will read this semester. Anything in our calendar, in our course schedule, any text on that schedule is fair game, anything that we've read or will read. So you're going to have to pick one of those texts and identify what ideal or what perfect way of life, perfect thinking, what should we do? Who should we be? How should society be run? We're going to have to identify that. Like, step one is, what ideals do we even see popping up in our writing? Sometimes they're really, really direct. In a lot of the political rhetoric that we read in Unit 1, we have really direct ideals. America should be governed in this way. People should be free from oppression, especially political oppression. We see a lot of ideals in the religious texts that we read that kind of highlight some of the religious thinking when we're talking about how America was founded and the people that lived here prior to America being its own government. We can see these really directly, but we can also identify, and this is going to take a little more analysis, we can identify an ideal that's being shared with us in an indirect way. And so what that comes across as is like a theme from the text. So if we look at Edgar Huntley as an example, and if we buy into this narrative, or if we buy into this theory that the whole purpose of these letters were to cause both Mary and Sarsfield's wife so much stress that they both miscarry their children. And we could ask why. Why is Edgar doing this to both of these women if we believe that that's, that theory? For Mary, Edgar doesn't want to be tied to the responsibilities of fatherhood. For Sarsfield's wife, Edgar would be the person who could inherit Sarsfield's money if he did not have a child. So it benefits Edgar for Sarsfield not to be a father, because then Edgar can function as the son and inherit when Sarsfield passes. Okay, so that gives motive for Edgar. But if we read that very last letter from Mr. Sarsfield to Edgar, where he says, "Let this be the last arrow in the quiver of adversity," and then he says, "Farewell," we note in the letter so much anger from Sarsfield to Edgar. Why did you do this? Why did you disobey me? I'm getting on a boat. I'm leaving. And that word farewell just feels so final. So if we look at that letter as Edgar's punishment for being mischievous, for being manipulative, and we're trying to identify an ideal, like maybe Charles Brockden Brown holds these values, and so that's why his characters take the paths that they do, then, and of course he wants to write a good story, but then we could argue and make the claim that one of Charles Brockden Brown's ideals reflected in early American lit is the ideal that sneaky, tricky, manipulative people will not prevail, will not win, will not get ultimately what they want. The classic good versus evil, I guess, kind of question. And we could identify that, and here I am presenting an option for really digging into analysis and identifying an ideal that's presented indirectly. Okay, so my point here is to illustrate that some of our texts very directly say, these are my ideals. These are my thoughts. This would be a perfect society. Here's what we should do. And some of our texts tell us a story or give us a little personal narrative, and we have to pull the ideals out through analysis, which is a little bit more challenging, but a little bit more interesting. However you want to approach this first question, where do we see an ideal of early American literature expressed or rejected? You want to approach it indirectly or directly, it's perfectly fine, however you want to do it. So getting back to this question, step one is identifying what ideal exists in one or more of the texts that we read. And you want to pick just one ideal and explore that throughout your paper. Now, where in modern America do we see it rejected or expressed? Okay, so that means identify the ideal and now decide, do we still hold this ideal? Like, is this still something that we believe to be true? Or have we rejected this ideal as a society in some way? Now, saying that we believe something to be true or that we have rejected something as a society is a bit broad, right? We as people all have different ideas. We all have different ways of thinking. And so it's okay to narrow that down and say, well, this one subset of society, this culture here, or, northern states, or Texas specifically, Seattle, Washington, whatever, the Midwest, or people who belong to certain groups, right? Maybe you want to narrow it down, and that's perfectly fine to do, but you want to decide, okay, you've identified an ideal, you know where it existed in the texts, you've kind of explored that in your paper. Now, does it still exist in modern America, or have we rejected it? You've narrowed that down, this group accepts it, this group rejects it, etc., whatever. And where in modern America, is it accepted or rejected? Where do you see that? How can you prove it? So you could look at the laws that we have. You could look at the practices. And practice is really broad, like the things that people do. We might have laws, but then we might bypass our laws. We might have guidelines, but people still do whatever they feel is appropriate for themselves. What is the practice or the action instead of the stated rule? So you might take a look at modern America, our laws, people's actions, maybe the political language that you're seeing, or even popular media. So you might look at a movie, TV, magazine article, particular religious groups or non-religious groups. There's all sorts of places that you could look to say, okay, I've identified an ideal. I see it being rejected by this particular group in modern America. Even if it's accepted by other groups, that could just be the focus of your paper. So it's okay to really narrow it down. So the path that you have to take is pick an ideal in a text where it's expressed that we've read or will read this semester. Decide if it's still accepted or rejected today and by whom, and then find support. Okay, again, look at our theories, our practices or actions of the different places that we live our lives, politics, media, social societies, groups that we belong to, etc. Okay, so this is kind of like an explanation of everything that I just went through. One thing to note, papers, I've had some papers in the past that cite just personal experiences instead of secondary sources when they are trying to argue whether it's this ideal still exists or not. And I find those papers to be ineffective. I think that you might mention a personal experience briefly in a sentence in conjunction with some secondary sources, but I don't really want to see personal experience in your paper. Obviously, this whole paper is subjective. It's your claim, your analysis, your opinion. But as far as saying, I belong to this particular group and I reject the ideal, so that means the ideal is rejected in modern America, I find that to be less effective than pointing to specific credible secondary sources. So I would like your research to go beyond just your personal experiences, and I would avoid personal experiences altogether if you can. Okay, so I have a little chart on the assignment sheet that I thought might be helpful as you're organizing your thinking. I'm looking for 4 full pages. You can write more than that. Ideally, you won't write much over 6 pages just because the scope of this assignment doesn't warrant it. I would like you to use 3 contemporary secondary sources. Again, these will be helpful when you are answering the part of the question that says, does modern America accept or reject, maybe, something in between, the ideal that you've identified. You can find anything that feels credible. Scholarly articles are great, newspaper articles are fine, trusted magazine articles, any law or public policy at the local, state, or national level. You can think of, TED Talks or even college courses that are being taught that might reflect particular ideals. So there's a lot of places that you could go to point and say, hey, this ideal is still present today and you can see it here, and that's the goal. Or this ideal is no longer present today and here's how I know, and pointing to some specific sources. Or these people, this group of individuals reject this ideal while this other group still accepts it. So I would like to just see an exploration on that. I want to see your analysis of the text, and then I want to see how you compare that to some kind of like direct pointing to our society in contemporary times. All right, here's an example thesis statement. The Puritan ideal of a charitable society, as seen in Winthrop's iconic sermon, is still publicly present in most Christian-based organizations in modern American society, although modern greed does not usually allow genuine facilitation of the ideal of charity. So your thesis statement needs to do a couple of things, and we see that in this example. One, we need to identify the ideal. For this example, it's an ideal of a charitable society. The thesis should identify what text you're analyzing from our class and where you found that ideal in. In this case, it's a text we didn't read this semester, but it's one of Winthrop's other sermons. And then your thesis statement should also directly say whether that ideal is still present or in what way. This example thesis statement kind of handles out, it is present, but not in the perfect way that Winthrop originally had expressed in his sermon. Most Christian-based organizations hold this ideal, but there's also greed. So the thesis allows for sort of this gray area, which is perfectly fine for you to do in your paper. But those are the 3 things that you should do in your thesis. Identify the ideal, identify the text where you found it, and let me know directly whether that ideal still exists today or not, and where. Down here, there's some information on structuring your paragraphs. So if you had any feedback on your first paper on structure, I would definitely dig into the notes on structure here and kind of make sure that you understand how to best structure your ideas. Use direct language as frequently as you can. That's going to be really helpful. And then also make sure that you have a works cited page. So your works cited page should include the primary text that you cite from our class, whatever early American text you've read and worked with for your paper, and then make sure that you have those 3 contemporary secondary sources. So that's going to be your research part where you're finding that comparison to modern day. Okay. Make sure your works cited page is in MLA format. If you are still struggling with citing in MLA format and you have taken any English class from Mitchell, you probably have access to the Little Seagull handbook. Please use this or some of the resources in the LMS to correctly create your works cited page. I would like to see some perfect pages at the end of this paper. And then the assignment sheet just walks through some helpful sources from the LMS, from lecture videos, and from the suggested handbook if you still have a copy of that from previous English classes. The rubric covers formatting, the thesis statement, if you are successfully identifying the ideal and how it's connected to modern America, providing evidence both that the ideal exists in the text and also evidence that the ideal is accepted or rejected today. So again, that kind of connects back to no personal experience. Obviously, I want to see your thinking. That's the analysis part of it. And then the development and structure of your paper. Are your ideas fully explained? Is your paper structured in an academic style? Introduction, body, paragraphs, conclusion, topic sentences, concluding sentences, that kind of thing. So if you have any questions about this, if you need help with anything, please email me as soon as something arises so that I can work with you or send you to the Writing Center if maybe that's what you'll need. Anything that pops up, please send me an email. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with.